Hi, everybody. Welcome to English 112. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 13th of September. And basically, last class, what we did was we reviewed the syllabus and the course outline. And I had you introduce yourself to your classmates. So this week, I see as introduction, where we're sort of laying the foundation for the rest of the semester. So some of the readings that I had assigned for this particular week include reading imaginative literature, which in the edition that I'm using is on page 1 through 7. Critical strategies for reading, which again in the edition I'm using is page 1641 to 1662, and also reading fiction, pages 13 through 22. Unfortunately, these are the readings that are copyrighted so that they are not available on the internet. However, I have put our text on reserve at the GCC library. When we get to the actual pieces of literature themselves, if I can find a link available online, and usually I can, I will share that with you. But what we're reading now is not the literature itself, but we're getting prepared to read the literature. And when I reviewed the course syllabus and outline, I didn't have a chance to talk about plagiarism. So I wanted to make sure that I could discuss it today. And I'm sure that you've heard of plagiarism before. It's basically using somebody else's language or ideas without acknowledging the source. That's the key, not giving credit. Because if you do give credit, then you're doing research, and that's exactly what you're supposed to be doing in the academic level. But in terms of not giving credit, it's the equivalent of theft. Basically, rather than taking a product, what you're taking is somebody's intellectual property. And it's just as serious. If you were to be caught plagiarizing, the most lenient punishment would be to fail the assignment, but the most severe would be expulsion from the college with the notation on your transcript that you plagiarized. So it's a fairly serious offense. And I kind of liken it to cheating on your taxes, and that it may be tempting, and it may even be easy, but the consequences are significant. And I always give two stories to try to encourage people not to plagiarize. The first occurred to me, actually, in the early days of my teaching career. So this was really pre-internet, and I'm reading a group of papers, and one paper sounds familiar. Not too surprising because teachers are fairly well read. But then what I ended up doing was trying to reflect upon where I had read this paper before, because ultimately I couldn't rely on the internet in order to do a check. And what I ended up finding was that I didn't have to think very long or very hard to figure out where the original source was, because it was from our actual textbook that I assigned for the class itself, as if I wouldn't notice. With a few mechanical errors, I don't know if this person was just sloppy in their plagiarizing, or that this person was hopeful that if I saw a few mechanical errors, I would think that this was their original work. But as I said, I couldn't rely on the internet. I'm not sure if you're aware of this or not, but as many resources as exist on the internet to help somebody plagiarize, an equal number exists to help professors determine if someone is plagiarizing. One of my favorites is Turnitin.com, where I could type in a sentence or a paragraph and do an electronic search. The better story occurred around the same time, but didn't occur to me. It occurred to a middle-aged professor. That part is important. And it appeared in all the academic newspapers. So this gives you an idea that there are such a thing as academic newspapers. And a professor, once again, is reading a set of papers and realizes that one sounds familiar. And he's thinking to himself, where have I read this before? And again, he couldn't rely on an electronic search on the internet. And as he continues to contemplate, he realizes he hadn't read it before. He had written it decades earlier when he was an undergraduate. That this was one of his old college papers. It had something to do with a fraternity that was recycling old papers from its fraternity members, and somehow, some way, this unfortunate student actually got access to one of his professor's old papers and submitted it in as his own. And I don't usually feel sorry for people who plagiarize, but I think I feel sorry for this student, because what are the chances of such a thing happening? And not only was he caught plagiarizing, but now it's become a media event. So those are my two stories to encourage you not to plagiarize. If you think about the kind of assignments we'll be doing over the course of this semester, they're also designed to encourage you not to plagiarize. I'm having you do informal journal writing assignments where you're not being evaluated for grammar or mechanics. I simply want you to reflect upon, for our first journal, 3 of the short stories that we'll be reading in the short story section. Approximately a page or so for each short story, so that would be about a 3-page journal. And I'm grading that on a checkmark system. And then for your first paper, you all have the option of revising that paper for a higher grade. After you've incorporated my comments into your revision, you can submit in your revision with the original. And keep in mind that the paper is a critical paper. I'm not asking you to do outside research, which sometimes can get tricky because then you have to determine which information is yours as opposed to which information belongs to someone else. And sometimes the lines can get blurred. That said, if you really want to do a research paper, I'm not averse to it, but the idea behind the critical paper is that you are refining your own interpretive skills, not necessarily relying on the interpretations of others. And if you think about our final exam, it's open book, open notes. So again, I'm hopeful that these sorts of assignments might take away any kind of temptation that you would have to plagiarize. So I think that covers most of what we had discussed with the syllabus. We usually talk about English classes as having a good amount of critical thinking and critical writing. And by critical, I don't necessarily mean criticism, but I mean asking and interpreting, doing what toddlers do very well, actually. They ask a lot of questions, usually why. And as we will find in literature, sometimes the questions are a lot more interesting than the answers. In fact, I've often said that really is the distinguishing factor between high school, when you learn a lot of what, and college, when you try to determine the whys of things. And sometimes it's not so easy. And of course, I had also reviewed the grading system of approximate percentages for the class, so that it's a combination of answering the attendance questions, and also it would be a combination of submitting in your journals and also submitting in your papers and your final examination. So in terms of today's reading imaginative literature, part of what we are trying to do is to define what literature is. And I suppose in the broadest sense of the word, literature is any piece of writing. I could go into a store and ask for a piece of literature for their, let's say, vacuum cleaner. And the idea is that I'm looking for the instruction manual. So it's something that's written. Though if you think about the great oral tradition of literature, it began from an oral perspective, some of the great epic poems. But fortunately for us, they were written down so that they were preserved through time. But that's not usually what we mean. When we're talking about literature, we're usually talking about storytelling. It's probably one of the first things we want as human beings. Think about your childhood. The idea of tell me a story, entertain me. And stories can be entertaining, but they can also be instructive and educational. And those are the kinds of pieces of literature that are probably worth some of our attention. Though not all literature is instructive or educational. Not all of it has a certain level of depth or sophistication or creativity. Some is just written purely for profit and entertainment. And there's nothing wrong with reading something just because it was constructed for profit or for entertainment, but it probably doesn't have enough depth or complexity for us to examine it further, the way we would with a piece of literature in an academic semester. So while it could have been written for profit and entertainment, there was also an additional reason. And I always think about Shakespeare because we usually critique those works that are written for popular audiences as written for just profit or entertainment. And Shakespeare wrote for profit. He was quite successful with his writing. And he also wrote for entertainment. It was really the television of the day. But if you know anything at all about Shakespeare, there's an additional level of complexity to his writing. So it's not that one necessarily negates the other, but you want to make sure that there is some depth and some sophistication. And hopefully, literature will broaden our perspective as well as entertain, and that it will provide some kind of social commentary and use language in interesting ways. And you can see this in the notes below the video, where I will be sharing basically the class notes that I use when I teach with you so that you can see the major points of these particular videos. There is no neat and tiny definition to literature. I mean, we could look up something in Webster's, but ultimately, we are going to be working with this over the course of the semester, especially when we start thinking about how to evaluate a piece of literature and whether or not it has quality. One of the more interesting things I thought about the readings was that it talked about how Moby Dick, title you might be familiar with, was not originally considered to be a great piece of literature. It was considered to be an examination of the study of whales, and it was only upon reflection years later that it was viewed as a piece of literature because it was suggestive and representational, that it wasn't just its literal meaning, but it could also be interpreted beyond the literal, which is what we usually talk about when we talk about literature. Now, who does this interpretation? And usually we talk about scholars and critics. The scholars and critics, because they have an educational background, make an evaluative judgment about quality. But of course, there's bias involved in that, and scholars and critics usually select pieces of literature that are reflective of their life histories and their interests. This came to a head in the 1960s or so when students became much more diverse in population and began asking where was their viewpoint in literature, because the scholars and the critics reflected their own viewpoint, but students necessarily didn't share that particular life history. So where was their age? Where was their gender? Where was their political affiliation? Where was their ethnicity? Where was their sexual orientation? And we can go on and on with the demographic groups. If nothing else, most pieces of literature studied by scholars and critics achieved a certain level of greatness because they had stood the test of time. So most of these authors were dead. And the idea is, where is my contemporary voice here? So usually when we talk about literature, there are names and authors and texts that we assume that are worthy of academic study. And Shakespeare oftentimes is at the top of the list. And these authors are considered part of the canon, those works considered by scholars and critics and teachers to be most important to read and study. But again, that's come under debate and dispute, certainly in more contemporary times. And so the canon can be political. And the canon doesn't necessarily have to be restricted to English classes. It can include history classes and lots of other disciplines as well. In terms of our class, we're going to be reading a little bit of everything. So the idea is that some of these authors haven't necessarily achieved the status of canon, but they have the depth and complexity within their writing that their writing is equally important. And in terms of critical strategies for reading, and this was a rather dense reading and a bit dry, keep in mind that this is not representational of the pieces of literature that we will actually be reading. It gives you a history of how literature was treated like an academic discipline, much like medicine or law, where there were individuals who specialized in particular ways of reading and interpreting literature. Usually these were university professors. And they, as individuals involved in a profession, oftentimes gave themselves names to indicate the kind of work that they specialized in. It all began about 100 years ago or so with the formalists, and they basically looked at the formal elements of a work, the language, the structure, the tone of a particular work. This led to the New Critics, and this is an unfortunate title, I believe, because if you are a new critic, then what happens as time progresses? Do you become an old critic, or is there a newer critic? But anyway, they focused on close reading of the work, the diction of the text itself, things like irony and paradox and symbolism, metaphor, characterization, narration, all of these terms that we oftentimes use with literature. So rather than having to be schooled in a a particular technique, such as the formalists were, anyone could approach a text and read it carefully and begin to get meaning out of it. Very common way for reading literature in classrooms, especially when you are just beginning your journey with reading literature. And then there were all kinds of branches that came out of the new critical method that started in the 40s and went into the 60s. Biographical critics. And luckily, many of these terms, you can guess what the focus was based on the terminology. Biographical critics focused just on that, biography, the biography of the author, arguing that in order to truly understand a work, you needed to know about the author's history, which makes a certain level of sense. But that also is limiting because you may not necessarily have access to the author's biography, or the biography might be incorrect, or just because someone has a particular biography, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's being reflected in their work. After all, this is a creative endeavor. But it does make a certain level of sense. Psychological critics examine just that, psychology and mental states, whether it be the psychology of the characters in the text that they're reading, or whether it be the psychology of the author who created the text, or whether it be the psychology of the consumers of the text. This would be us as readers, and how do our own mental states influence our interpretation. In many ways, what we're doing is we are acting like an attorney. We're gathering evidence, and any good attorney could gather evidence from both sides, the defense and the prosecution, and be able to present a case. Now, some cases have stronger pieces of evidence on one side or another, but a good attorney should be able to present evidence for either side, and then it's up to a judge and a jury to make a decision. Very same idea when it comes to literature, that what you are doing is you're using the text as the evidence, so to speak, to present a particular position. And in theory, you should be able to present multiple positions that could even be contradictory with one another. But as long as there's evidence to support that particular position, then that's a valid position. So the psychological critics moved over to the historical critics. You can see how this became more and more interdisciplinary, where historical critics examined past events, saying that you couldn't really understand a piece of literature unless you understood its time period, which makes sense. But again, that can also be limiting because we may not necessarily have complete access to the time period. And it's also quite labor intensive to learn everything about a time period before you're ready to read and interpret a particular text. Marxist critics. So if any of you are taking an economics class, this is about socioeconomics, and that the text can be read through the lens of, or the perspective of, socioeconomic inequality. The new historicist critics, because remember, we had the old historicists who were looking at history, things like the events in which major incidents occurred. The new historicist critics were talking more about culture, that basically these are the beliefs and the values and the attitudes of a group of individuals. And as you know, I'm interested in media and popular culture. There is a man by the name of Frank Luntz, who is quite famous in terms of some of his cultural work, particularly in reference to language. And that what he does is that he polls groups in order to determine which language might be the most persuasive in order to sway a particular group to support a position. And he oftentimes is hired by political groups, but he also is available to private industry as well. And whether you realize it or not, your life has been influenced by Frank Luntz. If you've ever heard a term such as the War on Terror, that's Frank Luntz. And this was in the early days of the Iraqi War, where he had argued that claiming a war against a peoples or a group was tricky because you weren't necessarily going to get universal buy-in. But if you could claim a war against terror, you are much more likely to get universal or closer to universal buy-in, because who supports terror? And it was also another argument that he made with something that was completely non-controversial for a long period of time, an estate tax, where you would tax individuals on their estate when they passed, when they died. And the reason why it wasn't controversial is because the state sounds wealthy. And he argued that if you really want individuals to no longer support this tax, he consulted with politicians and advised them to rename the tax, not to change the tax, but simply to rename it. And he renamed it to the death tax. And once it was called the death tax, and politicians seized on this idea, there was quite a bit of opposition to it because everybody understands what it means to be taxed to death, and that seems to be quite unfair, much more unfair than taxing someone's estate. Same tax, different name, different perspective. So why do I mention this? I mention this because Frank Luntz talks about, from his perspective, that if you really want to understand a people, you don't really want to understand their history, you want to understand their culture. And their culture is about their beliefs, their values, their attitudes, things like what they wear, what they eat, the music they listen to, the entertainment they consume, that's going to tell you a lot more about a people than their politics, let's say, or their educational level. And I think there is a good amount of truth to that. So if you're a new historical critic, you're very concerned with the culture of the time period and how that influences your understanding of a text. Or you could be a gender critic and you're doing just that. You're focusing on gender. And in fact, you can even specialize. For instance, you could be a feminist critic and you could specialize just on the way that female is presented in text. Or you could be a mythological critic. So if you know your mythology, then you can know that mythology oftentimes influences many of our current and contemporary stories. In fact, I had a very astute professor in college once say there are no new stories in literature. They're just retellings of old ones. So there are some universal stories of resurrection, rebirth, for instance, that you can find in mythology that's told over and over again in other kinds of literary pieces. So if you are a reader response critic, and this tends to be very popular with many students, the focus is not on the author or on the text. The focus is on the reader. The focus is on us. That we as reader, and I apologize for the telephone in the background, but that we as reader basically... Okay, so that is a friend of mine who's calling, so I'm just going to let that continue on. If you are a reader response critic, what you are doing is that you are putting the interpretation of the text in your hands rather than in the hands of a author or in the hands of the text itself. Again, it's a very appealing literary technique, but it can also be limiting as well. And the reason why is because reader response theorists oftentimes misinterpret what being a reader response interpretation is. It's not just that a text means anything that you want it to mean because you're the reader. There has to be evidence, as I was stating earlier, much like an attorney, in order to support a perspective. But as long as you've got evidence to support that perspective, as long as there's some consensus that that perspective is at least a possibility, then that's valid. And then we end with, or at least for our purposes, we end with deconstructionist critics. Note that this is a quite complex a set of theories about how to interpret literature. I spent an entire semester in graduate school studying this, and we're just doing a brief overview of just some major schools or ways to interpret. Deconstructionist critics look for deliberate contradiction. And their argument is that contradiction exists in everything, whether it's deliberate or not, and their job is to find it. So if you know the meaning of the word deconstruction, to take apart. So basically what deconstructionists do is that they look for interpretations that basically negate one another, that contradict one another, almost like adding a positive and a negative number where you end up with a zero. So the idea is that the text collapses upon itself because there's always contradiction. It was a very popular theory for a long period of time in the 80s and the 90s, much less so now because of the assumption that there is meaning in something. The deconstructionist theory that there is no meaning. It's a little bit hard to wrap your head around that there is contradiction and there is no meaning in everything, except in the premise that there is no meaning. So once individuals began thinking about it from that perspective, it became much less interesting from an academic perspective, but there's still deconstructionists out there. And I mention this not only to show you how professionals, just like lawyers and doctors, can specialize in a particular area. I also show you this as kind of limiting way of viewing literature. And I think it's also true of professionals who are specialists who oftentimes don't miss the most, or who oftentimes miss the most obvious things because they're too focused on their specialty. And I think that can happen as well if you declare yourself to be, let's say, a gender critic and you want to read everything from a feminist perspective. Rather than doing that, I think you should let the text determine for you how to read a particular text. And then you can decide whether that's valid or not valid. Let the text determine for you rather than you determine that you're going to read everything from a particular perspective. And then the last piece that I had assigned for today on pages 13 through 22 was about reading fiction. And that if we're going to be reading a piece of literature, and this is usually my definition of literature, something that can be reread and you can get new meaning from it. Again, you don't need to reread that instruction manual for the television set. Once you've read it and you've understood it, you're done. But a piece of literature, because it's so suggestive and it's so representational, is something that you can reread over and over again and find new meaning. And again, think about something of the, let's say, the age of Shakespeare, where individuals are still finding new meaning, even though those plays have been examined for hundreds of years. So what you want to do is careful and deliberate reading and rereading and annotating, taking notes, and journaling, which is basically something that I've incorporated as a graded element in this class, albeit informally graded. But I suggest that you can use journaling in all of your classes, and you should. That if you were taking notes of what it was that you were studying over the course of the semester, then you wouldn't need to cram at the ending because you would have the entire semester done piecemeal as it became applicable. So I encourage you to do journals, and there really is no right way to do a journal. It's almost like writing a diary, but rather than writing about your personal life, you are writing about the text that you are reading. And for us, you can see that they even give you an example of something that looks like a journal on page 20 of the edition that I'm using. I argue that it's a little bit more detailed than anything that perhaps you might consider as a journal, because you've got complete sentences and paragraphs. It actually is beginning to look like a paper at this point, which is useful if you're going to turn your journal into a paper. However, if you were to read the content, you'll see that the content is pretty informal. There are references to how the author's father and grandparents feel about the text. And that wouldn't be appropriate in an academic paper. It would be appropriate in a journal, though, where you are held to a much more informal standard. So I view the example that you're given in the textbook about writing very similar to, let's say, an in-between state of a journal and a paper, because your journals can just be bullet points, just ideas or notes. You've probably noticed that your textbooks have usually large margins, a good amount of white space there. That's for you to write notes in, even though I know you might be hesitant because you may not necessarily want to write notes in your book if you're going to return it. And certainly if you don't write an excessive amount of notes, you should be able to do so. But you could take those same notes on separate pieces of paper or on a computer screen. And that's basically what I'm asking you to do for the journals, because you will forget as you're reading. So you want to write things down, questions or observations that you've got. And of course, the more detailed you put together this journal, while I'm not grading for grammar or mechanics, certainly you can construct sentences and paragraphs, and that certainly will save you time if you're going to transfer those ideas into something like a paper, because now you've already got sentences and paragraphs developed. Though you don't necessarily have to do something like that in a journal, though certainly with a formal academic paper you would. And we'll talk a little bit more about the distinction between the two as the semester progresses. Again, these early sets of readings will give you examples of things like what a paper looks like, or what annotation, taking notes, looks like when you are reading a particular short story. So next class, what I wanted to do was to start talking about some of these short stories. And we will read two short stories. One is entitled The Secret Sorrow, and you can see in the notes below, this is in section 4. I've included a link for you that I was able to find online for this particular piece, though it is, of course, part of the textbook. And this story is part of a Harlequin romance. So if you've ever heard anything about Harlequin romances, then you know that they are considered to be popular fiction, that they are written primarily for entertainment and for profit. They don't require a lot of effort or a lot of thought. And there's nothing wrong with that. Certainly, if you've had a long day and you're looking for escapism, that's fine. But it probably does not require the close reading skills for the literature that we are going to be talking about over the course of the semester. So I wanted to use that as a contrast to another piece that has a similar title, but is very different in terms of the way that it's written, A Sorrowful Woman. And luckily I was able to find a link for that as well, even though it's included in your textbook. And as we compare and contrast the two, I hope you'll see the distinction between a piece of literature that's just merely a story that's told, that probably does not require rereading because it doesn't really have any kind of major social commentary or statement to make, as opposed to the kinds of pieces of literature that are usually included in the canon, those works considered by scholars and critics that are worthy of academic study. And then we would also continue on by talking about things like how do you go about writing about fiction, because eventually you will be doing both informal and formal writing assignments. So what's left is our discussion forum question. So we've spent a lot of time trying to define literature and determine what makes a piece of literature worthy of study. From your perspective, based on your understanding and your experience with reading in the past, what do you think makes a piece of literature worthy of study and why? What do you think makes a piece of literature worthy of study and why? There are no right or wrong answers. This just counts as your attendance for the class. And that's due Thursday by the 15th of September by 10 a.m. But certainly if you've got any, 12 a.m. or noon, I should say. But if you've got any questions or concerns about it, let me know. And certainly if you need an extension, let me know as well. But I'm hopeful that all of you will be able to do this by Thursday, so that ultimately what we can do is use those discussion forum responses as a springboard for what it is that we will be doing next class. And as I indicated, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read their responses and also to read my responses to their responses, because I will be responding to all of you. So this will give you an idea of what we would have talked about in class. So this is the class discussion as a substitute for the class or the discussion forum is a substitute for the class discussion that we would be having if we were meeting live. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class by comparing and contrasting two pieces of literature. Take care. Bye-bye.